I remember it well. I was standing on a 2x10 plank. It was maybe 10 feet long, that was suspended between two ladders. The plank was probably about 5 or 6 feet off of the ground. Myself and a couple of my friends were working for a painting business that was run by a family in my church that I grew up in when I was a kid. I had just graduated from high school, and I was using this job to save up some spending money for my first semester of college coming up in the fall. So there we were, standing on this plank. There were about 3 of us on this plank, and we were just scraping away. You know, when you don't paint very well for a painting business, they give you a scraper, and you have to scrape all day. So it wasn't the most interesting job in the world. So we did a lot of talking. We talked about everything under the sun. And at some point, the conversation turned to religion. It turned to faith. It turned to Jesus. And I remember at one point, I asked my friend John Price, explain something to me. Why is this Jesus fellow so important? Why do we talk about him so much in church? Now, don't get me wrong, I had attended church my whole life. I had read the Bible since I was able to read. But for some reason, the answer to that question had escaped me. Why was Jesus so important? And I can just remember John's very simple answer. He says, well, because Jesus is God. Because Jesus is God. I have to tell you, that was a huge moment for me in terms of my spirituality. That was a moment of clarity, a moment of understanding, a moment that transformed my faith. Before that moment, I was kind of on the fence about Christianity. But after that moment, I was all in. I finally understood it. Why did Jesus have the power to save? Because he was God. God came to earth and lived among us and died on the cross to save us from our sins. I'm guessing each of you have had similar moments in your own life. Moments in which your faith was changed forever. In those moments, faith stops being theoretical and becomes real. We all need those kind of moments from time to time in our lives. I think the moment for the disciples that we read today, this going up on Mount Transfiguration, was a life-changing event for the disciples, Peter, James, and John. I think prior to climbing the mountain there with Jesus, they had some understanding of who he was. They knew he was a gifted teacher. They'd experienced his ability to heal people in a miraculous way. And I think they had begun to understand that he was a great prophet, maybe as great as Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Daniel and Elijah. I think they may have even grasped at that time that God, he was God's anointed king, that he was the Messiah who would restore Israel's freedom and greatness. But they lacked one piece of understanding. For them, he was still just a man like all of us. They had yet to grasp the core of his being. Jesus was at his core the Son of God. He was God who came in the flesh for the one purpose of saving humanity from its sinfulness. That's the one thing they had yet to grasp until they got up there on the top of that mountain. And when they got up there, God revealed for them Jesus in all of his heavenly glory, symbolized by the white garments and the shining face, the face shining like the sun. The disciples were so awed by this experience, by what they saw, that Peter wants to stay there. And so he says to Jesus, let's build some cabins. let's build some cabins and stay here for a while. And if that isn't enough, God ratchets up the intensity of this moment, enveloping the disciples in a bright cloud. Now think about that for a moment. We don't typically think of clouds as bright, do we? So it almost sounds like an oxymoron, doesn't it? Really, when we think of clouds and they go over the sun, they make things darker, not brighter. But there was something divine, something miraculous about this cloud that when it enveloped them, it actually made things brighter, not darker. It was reminiscent of when Moses went up on Mount Sinai and received the Ten Commandments. It says that the cloud of the Lord appeared to him. The Shekinah glory is what they called it in the Old Testament. From within that cloud, there came a voice. This is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him. You know, that voice just wasn't for Peter, James, and John. That voice was for us as well. It's to help us grasp exactly who this Jesus fellow is. What makes him special? What makes him unique? Why should we follow him? Why? Because this is my Son. He is God in the flesh, whom I love. I'm very pleased with the work that he's doing, and you ought to listen to him. At this point, the disciples up there on the mountain, they're just overwhelmed. And so what do? They do what all of us would have done. They fell on their faces. They tried to make themselves as small as possible. They felt themselves in the presence of God, and it overwhelmed them. They thought they might die. From this point forward, there would be no doubt in their minds who this Jesus character was. He is God, and we ought to listen and to trust him. I'm sure you all remember the old hymn, the battle hymn of the Republic, right? Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. Well, in that hymn, there's a line that goes like this. In the beauty of the lilies, Christ was born across the sea, with a glory in his bosom that transfigures you and me. As he died to make men holy, let us live to make men free while God is marching on. You see, it just wasn't Jesus that was transfigured that day. The word transfigure means to be changed in a dramatic way. Peter, James, and John were forever transfigured, forever changed in a dramatic way by these events. Their faith in Jesus became real that day. And that was crucial for them. Because if you think about the gospel from this point forward, it's all about going to Jerusalem now and going to that final week of Jesus' life. It's about contemplating 50 days of that Lenten experience that the disciples had to go through. The days became darker and darker as they got closer and closer to Jerusalem. The heat was being turned up on Jesus to the maximum. Before the Transfiguration event, the question of whether the disciples' faith would be able to survive such an experience was very much in doubt. James and Peter and John were themselves fence sitters to a certain extent at this point. After these events on Mount Transfiguration, they had become believers. They had become true disciples. They were all in. Those events on the Mount of Transfiguration were intended to ensure that their faith could survive anything. Folks, this world throws a lot at us. Every single one of you is going to experience loss and tragedy and disappointment and suffering at some time in your life. And the only thing that's going to cause your faith to remain intact when you go through those experiences is understanding who is walking with you. You do not walk alone. You walk with Jesus, who is God. He alone has the power to sustain you through anything and everything that this world can throw at you. When the disciples came down off of that mountain with Jesus, all four of them walked into the valley of the shadow of death. Similarly, this church of ours is about to leave the Mount of Transfiguration, and we're going to walk into the Valley of Lent. Really, the Valley of Lent is the valley of the shadow of death. We're going to spend some time contemplating about the meaning of the cross. This Wednesday, Ash Wednesday, we're going to spend some time contemplating our own sinfulness. If you think about it, that's really the reason that Jesus had to come and die, is because we are sinners. Then we're going to journey on with Jesus as the skies darken until we finally get to Palm Sunday. And Jesus arrives in Jerusalem and announces that He's the King. Then we'll journey on to Holy Thursday. We'll have that last meal with Jesus as He gathers around the table and shares Holy Communion with His friends. And finally, we'll get to Good Friday. And we'll hear all those stories about betrayal and denial and death. And the question becomes, can our faith be sustained in the midst of that kind of suffering? I don't know about you folks, but by the time I get to the third or the fourth week of Lent, sometimes I'm like, oh, this is just such a downer. It's just so much tragedy, so much suffering, that I just want to say, I just wish Easter would get here. I just wish it would all end. Imagine how that must have been for Jesus, who really lived it. I mean, we go through Lent and we hear the stories. We think about the stories. And they bring a tremendous weight upon us. Imagine if you were actually living that. So the question becomes, can our faith endure the horror and the tragedy that we will witness during Lent? And the answer is only if we remember we walk with the one who has the power to bring life out of death. So come, let us walk the Lenten journey with Jesus, teacher, healer, prophet, Messiah, King, Lord, and God. Let's pray.